Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Maartje.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer, everyone. This week we're talking about Flags of Our Fathers, a movie that came out in 2006. It was directed by Clint Eastwood and written by William Broyles Jr. and Paul Haggis of Crash and Million Dollar Baby fame. It was produced by Steven Spielberg and co-produced by Clint Eastwood, and it's based on the book Flags of Our Fathers that came out in 2000 by James Bradley and Ron Powers about the six men who raised the American flag in the famous photo taken on Iwo Jima in 1945. And it also had a companion film called Letters from Iwo Jima, which was made by the same people and came out at the same time. And I have read the book, and Mart has watched a good chunk of Letters from Iwo Jima, so we come prepared, as usual, and we'll have lots to talk about. What did you think of Flags of Our Fathers?
I enjoyed it. It's not my favorite movie I've ever seen, and I thought I'd seen it before, but I haven't, so it was kind of like a first time watch for me, and I quite like the topics that are discussed in this movie, like propaganda and war propaganda and that sort of stuff. I thought that was an interesting take that I wasn't expecting it to have, so yeah, overall good vibes. I thought the acting was decent, but not remarkable. I would probably watch it again, especially now that I've watched part of the companion movie and I'm interested to compare them a little bit more. But I don't know. It's alright. It's not amazing, but not bad. How about you?
So I had seen this movie before. I watched it maybe when it came out when I was in high school. And the only thing I remembered about it was that Ryan Phillippe and Adam Beach were in it and that there were two flag raisings. Those were like the only two details I remembered. I think watching it again now, I am struck by the same amount of unremarkability, I guess, of this movie. It's fine. There are some good bits and pieces about it. I thought Adam Beach in particular pulled his weight acting wise. And I liked the premise of sort of seeing it from the son's point of view of, it's his father was one of the flag raisers and him trying to kind of tell that story a bit later on. And then us getting the war bond drive itself. And then also the guy's flashbacks to what actually happened on Iwo Jima. So I thought it could have been better than it was, I think. Not a terrible movie. I mean, I would never say absolutely don't watch it or anything, but I definitely not one of my top ones.
Right, I agree, but I liked it because we obviously talk quite a lot about media perception and how media is used to like tell the stories of war in a certain light. And this movie is really just about that, how one single photograph can change the way people think about the war, and it's used very specifically in a specific way to raise money for the effort, basically. And I thought it was an interesting thing that we talk about this all the time, but to see it an actual war movie is funny.
Yeah, and they really didn't shy away from that either, talking about what the photo was used for and the fact that they even say in the movie, the flag planting happened 35 days before the battle even ended. And these guys knew that they weren't heroes. All they did was put up a flag. And so they didn't shy away from that in the movie, which I did appreciate.
Yeah. So the other movie, I didn't watch the whole movie because I ran out of time, but the other movie is entirely in Japanese. So that's interesting, and it makes it obviously difficult to follow. You have to really pay attention if you don't speak Japanese. They do a thing where they use some of the same imagery from the other movie as well, and it's flipped. So it's literally the flip side of the American story is this story, which I thought was a clever storytelling device. So far, I like that better than I do this movie, even though I haven't finished it yet.
Yeah, so I read the book, as I said, and I would say the movie is pretty faithful to the book, follows it pretty much beat for beat, I guess. And I thought the book was just okay. You could tell that, of course, it was written by James Bradley, who is the son of one of the original flag raisers, John Doc Bradley. And you could tell that the book was really an ode to his father, kind of like a love letter to this man that he really didn't know very well. John Bradley kept a lot of this stuff really close to the vest. He never talked to his kids about any of it. And when he eventually passed away in 1994, I think that James Bradley, a big part of his grief maybe stemmed from this feeling that he didn't know his father very well. And so when he embarked on writing this book, he talks a little bit about how him and his family got to actually go to where the flag was raised, and they got to do a little family trip, which you're not allowed to just go there as a civilian. Like, you have to go there with the Marines. So yeah, he got to go up there and sort of explore that space with his family and what that felt like in the wake of his dad's passing. And so the whole book, you can tell it's sort of this guy trying to work through this relationship with his dad, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing at all. I think it can be a really interesting framing, but I just felt maybe the way that it was put together could have benefited a little bit from an editor maybe, or someone kind of coming in from an outside perspective and being like, okay, well, this piece is repetitive, or maybe we take this out, or maybe we rearrange this and put this over here. So not a terrible book, and definitely learned some interesting things. He really did his best to retrace the steps of all of these different guys on Iwo Jima, but probably not my favorite history book that I've read.
I can imagine, because it's so personal, it might not be as obvious to us who don't have that relationship.
All right, so should we talk about the plot?
Let's. The movie opens on Corpsman John Doc Brady hearing a call for a corpsman in the midst of battle, and this is something that will become a repeating motif. In this case, it's a dream or a memory by his older self, and we see him as an old man, played by George Grizzard. He collapses in his home as he calls out for someone, and we get introduced to the framing of the movie, which is that James Bradley, played by John McCartney, his son, is interviewing his father's wartime peers about his experiences during the war.
Yeah, this is constantly how John Bradley's PTSD, I guess, manifests. He'll be in the middle of a moment where something else is going on, and he'll hear someone call for a corpsman and sort of turn around.
Yes, I thought this was actually quite nice. I like these repeating motifs in movies. It's what kind of pulls you back into the core of the story, and I quite like it.
Yeah, we get to see how the famous flag-raising picture was chosen from all of the others that were taken that day, with a voiceover from one of these interviews that James Bradley is getting about how the picture provided a shorthand to the American people that was easy to understand. It was obviously like a very striking image. It helped invoke a lot of patriotism. And he says, the right picture can win or lose a war. And we watch the picture begin to proliferate across the country. We see it being put down on the desk of the president himself. We see Belle Block, played by Judith Ivey, who's the mother of Harlan Block. He was initially misidentified in the photo. We realize later on in the movie that it was him in the photo, but he's been misidentified as someone else. So we see his mother see the photo, and she's immediately knows that that's her son, even though he hasn't been identified that way.
She says, I would know that bum anywhere because I've put him in diapers.
Yeah.
For those who don't know the photo, all the soldiers on this photo, all the Marines on this photo are seen from behind. You can't see any of their faces, and they're putting this flag into the rocks of Iwo Jima. So it could just be anyone. That's the interesting thing about this photo.
This happened in real life too. Harlan Block's mother did see the photo and immediately was like, that's my kid. And it took quite a long time for him to be correctly identified in the photo, which was a source of great pain for their family. She ended up leaving her husband. They separated. She never recovered from her son's death. So yeah, I was glad to see that they included that in the movie.
Yeah, so for everyone's information, not everybody on the photo survives. A couple of them die. So that's also part of the conflict of the movie, is who is in this photo and who isn't on the photo. And the theme is a lot about what makes people heroes or what doesn't make them heroes. It's constantly these men struggling with the idea that they are made out to be heroes, even though they don't feel like heroes. It's got some themes that could have been, I feel, explored more deeply or better, but they are interesting themes. And it didn't necessarily feel super patriotic to me. It was partly even quite the opposite.
Yeah, they did acknowledge the cynicism in choosing this picture and putting it all over the papers and then using it as the basis for a war bond drive and bringing these guys home. And they've just come from a battle, and we'll talk about this more, but Doc's been injured in battle and he has to delay his surgery so he can go on this war bond tour. And these guys are really not being treated like they're individual people. They're being treated as these mythic heroes that people can just project whatever they want to onto them.
Yeah. We go again to John Bradley, played by Ryan Phillippe, Marine PFC Renee Gagnon, played by Jesse Bradford, and Marine PFC Ira Hayes, played by Anna Beach. who we both really like on this. They are on the war bond because of their participation in the flag raising on Iwo Jima. The photo was taken on February 1945. They immediately noticed that Sergeant Hank Hansen, played by Paul Walker, who was a baby in this, has been incorrectly identified as a flag raiser, rather than Corporal Harlan Block, played by Benjamin Walker. But they are told to keep their mouths shut. The war bond drive is too important. They need to raise $14 billion, more than ever before, and more than all the other war drives put together, is something they say in the movie. The other flag raisers involved, including Harlan, Sergeant Mike Strank, played by Barry Pepper, and PFC Franklin Susley, played by Joseph Michael Kress, have since been killed, so they can't be there with them.
Yeah. It's pretty brutal that in the few weeks between this photo being taken and when the Americans were victorious on Iwo Jima and when this picture starts to become famous and it's decided that it's going to be the basis for a war bond drive, it's really a matter of like a month. This photo is taken on February 23rd. The battle is over at the end of March. And in that span of time, 3 of the 6 have been killed in battle.
Yeah. I don't think people understand, or I don't think you can even understand how brutal this battle was. It's like on an island, there's nothing on the island. The soil stinks, it smells of sulfur, and there's nothing that grows there, and it's just this barren, rocky island. And it's rough on both sides of the forces, I think. The Japanese lost loads of men, as did the Americans. So it feels really almost a bit pointless. It's not pointless, there's a point to it in the eyes of the Americans and the Japanese. But it feels so meaningless because it's such a barren island.
Yeah, they make a comment towards the end of the movie where it's John Bradley and one of the other guys, and he's just about to be evacuated out at the end of the battle, and they look up and they see a damaged B-17 that's able to, or not a B-17, I think it's a B-24, but anyway, a bomber that gets to land on the airstrip. And that was a big reason why the Americans wanted to take the island, was because from here, they would be able to not only more easily bomb Tokyo and mainland Japan, but if they had bombers that were damaged, a lot of the time those bombers could not make it all the way back to where they needed to go. And so by having this sort of intermediary point, like a safe place that was held by the Americans where these damaged bombers could land, it actually saved the lives of a lot of bomber crews.
I also thought it might be interesting to point out that Barry Pepper is also in Saving Private Ryan, and instead of having a boot camp, Barry Pepper actually kind of trained and informed the other actors about what it was like to do a war movie. I thought that was an interesting detail. And there was no boot camp for this, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And also especially interesting because he plays the sergeant, the guy they all look up to, who's in charge of them in the movie. And it sounds like in real life too. As they continue the war bond drive, they're going from city to city. They're unveiling little monuments. They're getting their pictures taken. They're shaking hands, kissing babies. And they meet the mothers of their dead friends, which is pretty gut-wrenching. There's a scene where Ira Hayes meets I believe it's the mother of Mike Strank. He just gives her a big hug and he's crying and she's crying. And it's very sad. And Ira, of course, he's wrestling with this, meeting the parents of his dead friends and feeling like he's being called a hero and he doesn't think that he's a hero. And so he starts to struggle with alcohol. He's drinking quite heavily. And as all of this is going on, we're getting flashbacks of what actually happened to all of these guys on Iwo.
I also think it's worth a mention that Ira is Native American and he also is facing quite a lot of racism, even though he is a war hero. So on top of all that, on top of all the horror that he's seen, he has to come home and be subjected to pretty bad racism. And even some from his fellow men. I thought that was they all call him Chief, but they also say some other stuff that I thought was kind of questionable.
Yeah, they really never let him forget that he's other. That's for sure.
Yeah. The 28th Marine Regiment, 5th Marine Division, of which the men's unit of Easy Company is a part, lands on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945. The Navy has already been bombarding the island, and it's eerily quiet when they land. Enough so that PFC Ralph Ignatowski, played by Jamie Pell, asks if the Japanese are all dead. They don't know how deeply the Japanese are dug into tunnels beneath the surface of the island, but they will soon find out. I thought you said it was clear. It was.
Yeah, so they think, oh, the Navy's been shelling the shit out of this place. There can't be there
Anyone
can't be
left? Yeah.
anyone left. And they're very wrong about that. And every time they think they've cleared a little, a pillbox or an installation,
Yeah.
well, the Japanese just send more people up from underground. So
Yeah.
very
So
harrowing.
it is. And in the other movie, Letters from Iwo Jima, what I've seen so far, I've seen the first 15 minutes of it. They've just finished digging all the tunnels and they've explained why they've done tunnels and why they're not they started out digging trenches on the beaches and then a new commander comes in and he's like, no, wait a second, go up the hill and dig tunnels. So they've explained all the reasoning for that in the other movie. It's quite interesting to get that other perspective as well. But I liked Jamie Bell's character. He's quite important to our main character, John.
Yeah, they call him Iggy, and he's constantly the one who's, he seems like a bit younger, maybe a bit naive, but he's very close with our main character, John Bradley.
They've kind of decided, or maybe Iggy has actually decided that they're gonna be buddies. He says this to John as well. And in the beginning of the movie, we are kind of made to believe that John is calling out for him because he keeps asking, where'd he go? Where is he? And we find out later what has happened to Iggy.
Yeah, and what happened to Iggy in the book was I think the defining incident of John Bradley's war. It followed him for the rest of his life. He once explained to one of his children what had really happened to Iggy and never spoke about it again. And yeah, really something that this guy carried with him forever.
Is it true to what happens in the film? Is the film true to the book?
Yeah, so we'll definitely get into it, but Iggy ends up being tortured for several days by the Japanese, and they do truly heinous things to his body, and John finds him and sees what happened.
Right. So they don't show you what happened to him in the movie, which I'm guessing is a good thing.
Oh, yeah. So despite heavy casualties, they are able to secure the beach on the island, and they move on to attack Mount Suribachi. So the whole island of Iwo Jima kind of looks like a pork chop, which I think they say in the movie, but it's true. And so there's kind of one end of it where there's a mountain that's raised above everything else. So they know you kind of want to take the high ground, right? And so that's their next goal. We see Doc carry out the actions that will earn him his Navy Cross. He's saving a lot of lives. He's putting his own life at risk. And Sergeant Hank Henson's platoon is the first up to the top of the mountain after the fighting is done. They put up an American flag. It's not really a huge deal. Everyone's cheering, and people are happy to see the flag, but it's, not the be all end all or anything. And then Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, who's played by Robert Patrick, he decides that he wants the unit to keep the flag. It's the first flag up on Iwo, and they don't want to be giving it away to any politicians, and he wants to make sure it stays in the Marines. And so he sends Renee, our character of Renee Gagnon, who's a runner, up to ask Mike Strang's platoon to just grab the original flag, bring it back to him so he can keep it safe, and put up a replacement flag, a bigger one.
A nicer one. A really fancy marketing flag. That's interesting, by the way, that Rene was made a runner, because I think it's Trank that initially says that he's not a very good soldier and that maybe he should be kept away from all the action. And then the other commander says, all right, we'll make him a runner.
Yeah, they talk about that in the book a little bit, about how he wasn't really a soldier's soldier. He didn't get along too well with the other guys. He didn't seem, to really have his head in the game all the time. One of those guys who was really good looking and I think maybe a bit used to cruising by on that.
Yeah, you get a little bit of that in the movie too. That he seems to enjoy the Warband drive quite a bit more than the other ones. And he's not always very nice to them either.
Yeah.
Kind of mean.
Yeah. Maybe worth mentioning too, so John Bradley is a Navy corpsman and all the rest of these guys are Marines. And John Bradley was trained by the Navy. He was part of the Navy, but what would happen is sometimes Navy corpsmen would end up on loan to these Marine divisions. And so that's why when you see him throughout the movie, he's wearing a different uniform than the other two when they're on their war bond drive.
That explains it. I was wondering about that. I didn't actually know.
Yeah,
Thank you.
He's a sailor.
I struggled to take them seriously in that uniform. It's not their fault. It's just a uniform. Joe Rosenthal, played by Ned Eisenberg, captures the moment they raise the second flag on his camera. So that's the moment the famous photograph is taken.
It's interesting because obviously they already have a photo of the first flag that was raised. And so him taking this picture of the second flag raising is almost sort of incidental. It's like, well, I'll grab a shot of that. And at the time when he took the picture, the real Joe Rosenthal was not even sure that he got a good shot. He thought it might be blurry. So he was like, well, And at the time, there was no way to check right away, right? So he's like, well, I'll send it to get developed and they'll let me know if there's any good ones.
It's a pretty iconic photo too. It's an interesting composition as well. I wonder, it's almost impossible to think that this is like an accidental photo. It looks so like, I don't know. It looks like a fake composition, and the second photo would have been, that is a fake photo, to be honest. But still, it doesn't look like a candid picture at all.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the movie, he says something regretful about how he didn't capture any of their faces. And in real life, Joe Rosenthal actually took several pictures up there. So after the flag went up, he got a whole bunch of the guys who had raised the first flag and the second flag to all kind of stand around the flag and take a picture where they're all looking at the camera and everything like that, so that he could get all their faces in. And then later on, one of his journalist friends was like, oh, that picture was posed, right? Well, he didn't know that the flag picture was like starting to pick up traction. So in his mind, he thought that they were talking about the picture where he did pose all the guys and get them to look at the camera. So he said, yeah, it's posed. And so that's where this rumor came from, that the flag raising photo itself was posed.
Yeah, and was fake. Yeah. It's such a propaganda kind of media, almost a modern thing to have happened back in the day. And nowadays we can't look at a photo without questioning whether it's real or not. But this one was actually just an accident, and it was real. But just one sentence from the photographer who misunderstood what they meant changed the entire story of that photo.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a neat thing to meditate on, this idea of assigning meaning and significance to things, because the photos of the first flag raising didn't become famous. No one's really interested in seeing those, especially after the second one was obviously such a great photograph, so striking, and it really captured people's imaginations. And it's like, well, does it matter? Like, what makes the first flag raising significant in people's minds? Like, does it matter really that the second flag raising was technically the replacement flag?
It really doesn't, if you think about it. I mean, it also did what they wanted it to do, which was raise popularity for the war and raise money for the war. So it did what it was meant to do. And probably the first photo wasn't going to do as well because the photo wasn't as striking.
Spoiler alert, they did raise this absolutely absurd goal of 14 billion or whatever it was. They did end up raising that money.
I can't even imagine that much money in my head.
The next part of the movie is the sad verse, I guess you could say. We see Mike Strank killed by friendly fire. He gets unfortunately hit by some U.S. artillery. This is followed soon after by the deaths of Hank and Harlan. We also see Doc looking for Iggy, who, as we briefly touched on earlier, was dragged into a tunnel and tortured by the Japanese. Franklin dies in Ira's arms a few days later. It's obviously a very traumatizing event for him. And Doc winds up being wounded, and they're trying to evacuate him, but he keeps crawling around to help other people, even while he's bleeding all over the place. But ultimately, they do track him down and send him home. And the battle ends with a U.S. victory on March 26th, which is 35 days after the flag was raised. And Renee ends up being asked to identify the men in the photo after it starts to get popular. And he knows that Ira was in the photo, of course, but Ira tries to threaten him into keeping his mouth shut. It doesn't work. And so this is when Ira and Doc and Renee all get sent stateside for this war bond drive.
Yes. I want to just quickly stop to mention Mike Strank, because in the very beginning of the movie, he gets a choice to not be on the front lines. I don't remember where they offer to send him, but he opts to stay with his men because he made them a promise to get them out alive. So this guy dies, even though he could have not been on the island or not been on the front lines like that. It's so sad.
Yeah, it's tough. And obviously an extremely senseless death. It's tough. It's a huge theme in this movie is the nature of heroism and all of these guys being sent home because they were in this picture, not for doing anything particularly heroic, but just for putting up a flag. And they have their own struggles with being called a hero, especially when so many of their friends have just so recently died and been killed in these terrible ways. And, in this case, Mike was killed by friendly fire. It shouldn't have happened. He didn't die saving anyone. He didn't die doing anything quote unquote heroic, but all the same, he had done things before in support of his friends and his men. And so, just a lot of things to think about in this movie when we think about what makes a hero.
They do make a point of reminding us with every war bond drive that the real heroes are the men who died on the island. The soldiers that are with us, like Doc and Rene and Ira, they keep saying, we're not the heroes, we just raised the flag. And they let them say it, but they're not super happy about it. I think the powers that be on this war drive.
There's a part in the book where Ira goes home after the war, and one of the things that really kills him is that all of the guys back home call him war hero or like Iwo Jima hero or like big hero, or like anytime they talk to him, they almost sort of say it jestingly even, because he, came home and went on this war bond drive and they got to stay in nice hotels and drive fancy cars and have good food and etc. And so a lot of people that he knew from growing up obviously didn't think he was any hot shit. And so he really hated that. He hated this whole idea of, being called a hero.
It results in him getting drunk one too many times. And on one of these war bond drives, he makes a scene in front of General Alexander Vandergrift, played by Chris Bauer. And it gets him sent back to his unit, which is what he wanted, but it feels kind of rough. And Rene and Doc complete the war bond tour alone. Rene gets engaged to Pauline Hanra, played by Melanie Linsky. And Doc, reluctantly, I want to say, becomes his best man in the movie, at least.
Yeah, just to point out that Alexander Vandergrift was the big hero of Guadalcanal. He was the CO on Guadalcanal who kind of held out despite all odds.
That's good to know. I didn't know. Thank you.
Yeah, and the real person, I guess, of Pauline Harnois. In the book, it's funny because, I don't think that James Bradley had a huge amount of esteem for this woman. I gather what happened was she had met Rainey briefly, and she was kind of hounding him to get engaged, and Rainey's mother told him not to do it. Rainey's mother didn't come to the wedding. And
wow.
Yeah, and Rainey and Pauline ended up having one son together who became friends with James Bradley later on when they were adults. And he said, my dad was always caught in the nowhere land of his marriage, something like that. And so it felt like, they really were not super happily married because she was always interested in the side of that came with him being, the big famous war hero. And ultimately, as we'll see a little bit later, that did not translate very well into civilian life.
She's kind of made to be a little bit annoying in the movie. She loves the attention, she loves the cameras, and the other guys find it annoying. And I'm sure that came from the book then. I mean, it makes me sad that there's only a few female characters in the books, and they're either moms or this woman, and this woman is just annoying.
At least she has something to do, I guess. It's more than you can say for some of these movies. There's actually a scene earlier on where Doc is meeting the mother of the Paul Walker character, Henson, and he's the one, of course, who's been misidentified in the photo, and Doc and the other guys know that that's not Henson in the photo. And she asks Doc to point him out to her. She's like, is that my son? Can you confirm it? And he doesn't have the heart to lie to her. And so he doesn't tell her. And man, that's a whole other layer there too as well,
Yeah, I mean, I can understand why you wouldn't say anything. But it's just heartbreaking for the mothers of the guys that were there instead of this man who did not get any recognition until much, much later.
Yeah. So I was glad that in terms of, female character representation, we did get to see, the various moms and their reactions and all that kind of stuff. After the war, Ira continues to really struggle with alcohol, which gets him into trouble. He gets arrested a few times. People view him as the hero of Iwo Jima, like we talked about, which he really despises. He carries around a little American flag in his pocket. And when people stop and see him and ask for a photo, he'll, take out the little flag and take a picture of him. It's kind of sad. And he ends up hitchhiking 1,300 miles to visit Harlan Block's father and tell him that it was really Harlan in the photo and not Hank Henson. And Harlan Block's mother, Belle, ends up being vindicated. But of course, this means that Hank Henson's mother finds out that it's not really her son. And so it's not really, gosh, you're kind of between a rock and a hard place. It's the one family so long afterwards gets to find out that, it was their son in the photo after all the adulation and the cheering crowds are gone. And another mother who really put a lot of stock into that gets her heart broken again. It's a tough one.
It broke my heart when that mother was not allowed to be at the memorial, at the unveiling of the war memorial.
Oh yeah, they basically were like, "Oh, that's not Henson in the photo. Great, we're not inviting his parents to anything ever again."
It's so brutal. It's just so harsh.
Rainey finds out that many of the offers for employment that he got during his 15 minutes of fame are now worthless. He's trying to follow up and call people, and no one's taking his calls. And Doc quietly returns to work at a funeral home, and he does not take any calls about the flag raising, and he does his best to just forget that anything ever happened.
I enjoyed the moment where his son, his young son in the bit we see, answers the phone and has to tell the reporter that he's gone fishing in Canada.
Yeah, apparently that was their big lie. That's what they said every year when people called. They would always be like, "Yeah, he's not here. He's fishing in Canada. Sorry, he's unreachable."
The three flag raisers see one another one final time at the dedication of the USMC War Memorial in 1954. Ira dies of exposure the following year. They also mention that there's no autopsy performed on him, so I don't know what they say that so specifically in the movie, like something else is going on maybe. Doc finally goes to visit Iggy's mother, and Renee ends up living unhappily as a janitor, so his life of glory has ended and him being unhappy and sad. I don't know, I didn't really like this ending too much.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll read the last point so we can talk about the ending.
Yeah,
But
sorry.
in 1994, as he is dying, Doc tells his son James, the man who went on to write the book, that he wishes he'd been a better father. They talk a little bit about Iggy, and the movie closes with Doc and his friends swimming in the ocean off of Iwo in 1945. And there's a bit of a voiceover from James saying that we should remember these guys the way my dad knew them, and et cetera, et cetera. And I agree with you. I thought this ending was weak.
Also, in that final scene of Doc on his deathbed, it's revealed that the person he was calling out to when he was having, I think, a heart attack in the very first scene, the person he's calling out to was not Iggy, but it was actually his son, which, from what you told me about the book, about this being like his search into this father that he never really knew, it feels kind of hard to believe that that was actually, it feels a little bit more sappy than it was in real life.
Yeah, we did talk about this a little offline. You know, James Bradley's not knowing of his father is what drives him to do all this research, to go to Iwo Jima, to write the book, to talk to all these guys. And he's trying to understand something that he functionally will never be able to because his father died and took all of that to his grave. So there's never going to be a "I wish I were a better father" scene. There's never going to be his dad explaining what happened with Iggy. There's none of that stuff is ever going to happen. And he just, this is like him sitting in his grief and trying to understand. And so putting that ending on the movie, I felt was a bit of a betrayal of that premise of the book, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like almost a happy ending for them where there wasn't one in real life. Because
Yeah.
it feels like almost this reunion of a lost father and a son that don't really know each other, and that gets almost resolved in that very last scene. Like he opens up to him and he tells him that he was calling out for him after all. I get what you mean in saying if the premise of the book is that he's grappling with the not knowing his father, then that last point kind of negates that almost.
Yeah. And I think all of this, James Bradley trying to understand this man that he loved but didn't functionally know very well, that flavors the book so heavily that it just seemed odd to me in the movie that they touch on it kind of briefly at the beginning and at the end. And obviously he's the one doing the interviews, but that sort of feeling of this being a son's grief, a son's love letter to his father, it doesn't infuse the movie the way it does in the book, which could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you feel about that as a premise. But it does feel like they were, at the end of the movie, they were like, "Oh shit, we should probably tie that up somehow."
Yeah, and it also feels to me like in the movie, the son is almost like this. He doesn't get any feelings in the movie. He's just this bystander that's narrating the story. And I take it from the book that it's actually him having most of the feelings because he's writing this book from a very personal place. And to me, it's almost impersonal in the movie. And then suddenly at the end, we're supposed to feel for him on his father's deathbed. And I don't really get the emotion there. So I don't know. I thought it was alright. It's not. I thought the ending was quite long as well. Like the last 30 minutes is kind of them wrapping up everybody's stories, and it takes just a little bit too long, in my opinion. It also ends with an image of Iwo Jima. where kind of the camera's kind of over this war memorial on Iwo Jima with all the dog tags on it. And the camera drifts down onto the beach. And in the opening of Letters from Iwo Jima, the film opens on the same shot, but it's a Japanese, not memorial, I think, but just a Japanese, I don't know, artwork. I don't know what it says. I can't read it. It's in Japanese, but it's the exact same shot as the closing shot of this movie, which is interesting.
That is interesting. I also thought it was it reminded me a little bit of Saving Private Ryan in the way that all of the shots on Iwo Jima are not sepia toned, but they're kind of dark. Like they have the color leached out of them as if they are a memory, or the footage that people saw later of places like Normandy and Iwo Jima where they were getting like a newsreel basically, and it was not in full color. And so you could tell what was kind of a memory or a flashback and what wasn't. So that was also a storytelling device that we saw here.
And the beach landing on Iwo Jima is filmed in a similar way to Saving Private Ryan as well. Handheld and shaky and chaotic. I quite like this movie, but also it lacked a little bit in emotion almost. I couldn't quite connect with anyone except maybe Ira, who's the only one who you really see struggle. You see it a little bit, I think, in Doc, but not quite as heavily.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I don't know if it's an acting issue. When I feel like every character in a movie is a bit emotionally flat, I usually assume that it's probably a director issue. The guy who wrote the movie, Paul Haggis, is known for being quite a good screenwriter. And so I don't really want to blame the writing either. I think maybe Clint Eastwood making a war movie he's of a certain era, of a certain generation. I wonder if that factored into the sort of limited feelings that we saw in this movie. If maybe, Ira having these drinking problems and he's the only one who gets to express like this real emotion, but it's because he's drunk. It's because he's not in control of himself. And then like nobody else, we don't really see a ton of that from Rainey and Doc.
No, that's very true. Also, fun fact, this is Clint Eastwood's son, first movie role in this film as well.
Oh.
Which I wonder how he got this part. Really, I do. He's not bad. He's good in this movie. It's fine.
Yeah.
I don't know what happens to him, to be honest. Does he die? Does he survive? Do we know?
I don't even know who he plays.
It's like Lindbergh or something he plays. But it's just one of the guys.
Yeah, no, I don't. I'm not sure. I got to the end of this 400-page book, which was written in the year 2000, obviously. So John Bradley died in 1994. James Bradley published this book in the year 2000. Flags of Our Fathers comes out in 2006. And then there's an afterword in the book from about 10 years later where we learned that John Bradley was not even in the photo. I was like, after I read this entire book about a son trying to understand his father through this like prism of this one picture and this one experience, John Bradley's not even one of the guys.
Yeah, he wasn't even there. He was there. He was there.
What happened was the Marine Corps had been sitting on all these photos. They were in a vault in an archive somewhere for like 70 years. And there were photos of all the scenes that had happened that day from different angles, from different photographers. And so they released a bunch of these photos. And when they did that and they looked at, they got a better view of the faces from different perspectives, they realized that John Bradley could not have been one of the flag raisers in the second photo because he was actually one of the flag raisers in the first photo. So he was, a flag raiser in a manner of speaking. He just was not in the famous photograph that was taken. And his son suggests that what probably happened was he was quite badly wounded. He was evacuated. And when he woke up in the hospital, someone asked him if he was in that flag picture. Well, he didn't know which picture was famous. And he was like, yeah, I was in a flag picture. Like a lot of shit happened that day. And they were like, oh, so like you're one of these guys. And he's like, if you say so. That's kind of how that ended up happening, I gather.
Even funnier, I copied something into our document and I didn't even read it properly. But in 2019, another one of the flag raisers, Renee Kenyon, one of the three, was also not in the photo.
Yeah, and what's funny about that is Rainey was the one in the first place whose identity they were so sure of that they asked him to identify everyone else who was in the picture.
It's wild, this. Like, only one of the three was actually in the picture. Like only
Yeah.
Ira was in it, and he didn't even want to be there.
Yeah. So now we know that the person that they thought was PFC Rini Gagnon is actually PFC Harold Pye Keller. And the person that they had thought was Corman John Bradley was actually PFC Harold Schultz.
Yeah, it's wild like that, I guess. If we've learned anything from this incident, is that you should never take pictures of people from the back because you'll never know who they are.
That's the one lesson we've learned from this movie.
And again, all these white guys look the same.
Oh, literally. I mean, they're all in their helmets and everything. Like, there's no way like that you would know. And I don't even blame these guys who were, mistakenly identified in the picture, because so many of the guys that they were with that day were subsequently killed. So it's not like they could go back and be like, hey, was that you in the picture? And the day's events, there was just so much going on. Like I said, Bradley was wounded. A lot of them were wounded. And then once the picture became famous, they were like, well, maybe I was in that picture,
It's not like there was internet and they could check which picture they were talking about. Media, man, media is weird.
It is so weird. That's kind of picks back up to what we were talking about before, about how the picture of the second flag raising was the one that got famous. And then this kind of conversation around, like, does it matter that that wasn't the first flag raising? That was, that was the picture that raised $14 billion for the war effort. That was, there were some guys who also raised a flag that morning. And so now looking back on it, it's okay, well, John Bradley isn't in the second picture. Like, does that ultimately matter? Should that change anything?
Probably not. And my answer would be it doesn't. It's fine because it did what it was supposed to do. What I find even funnier is that there was no way of knowing if it's such a heroic victory kind of picture, even though the victory was far from guaranteed at that point. Like, they could have just lost.
Well, they talk about this in the book as well. The fact that picture came out and all of a sudden nobody at home cared about Iwo Jima anymore, because in everyone's minds, the battle had already been won. And so there were guys over there, obviously having a real struggle, and everyone back home was like, all right, well, that one's done. On to the next, on to the coverage of, whatever's going on in Europe, or,
I do wonder if Europe in general was an easier topic for people to understand because people look like them. I mean, the Pacific and the Japanese, that must have felt so much more foreign to Americans and to people, to people who were not in the war in general. I think this part of the war was maybe harder to sell, even though I guess Japan did attack America, so maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's easier to sell this one.
Well, I think, too, the geography is harder to understand. I mean, they're fighting over these little hunks of volcanic rock in the ocean that no one had ever heard of and no one ever will hear of again because they don't matter. And and I mean, at this point in the war, they talk about this a little bit in the movie, but people were just sick to the back teeth of it. It's February 1945. It's been going on for a long time. Things are drawing to a close in Europe. We're a couple months away from Hitler killing himself. And so the fact that we got, 6 months to go still in the Pacific, it's really, I think, just wearing on people.
And they had no money left, right? Everything was gone. They needed this money to be able to win the war.
Yeah, it was definitely a big last push sort of situation, it seems like.
On this War Bond Drive, they have a little thing in the stadium where they're supposed to climb this fake mountain and plant a flag. I just want to know, who the fuck approved this? How is this a good idea with all the fireworks going off?
I know, they really were not. They were like, fuck your PTSD. We're going to need you to climb this mountain. Everyone is going to think it's really cool. Then we're going to have a marching band go by. There's going to be fireworks. You're going to hate every second of it. Cool?
Because all three of them have serious flashbacks. And I think it's one of the first scenes we see actually where Doc has the flashback to Iggy, and then we flash back to the actual scene with Iggy. I don't know. The puppeteering in this scene is very strong. It's like, let's make this very fake. And then in the scene, they do it quite smartly because the first time we see it, you don't really know that it's not real. So you think for a second they're on an actual mountain, and then it comes up and it's a stadium. So it's, I don't know. I thought that was an interesting scene that I just wanted to quickly acknowledge.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. And I also, there's sort of a little thread in there about the fact that Doc and Rini seem to mostly have their shit together in terms of, not visually displaying effects of PTSD, but like we as the audience know, for example, that Doc keeps hearing someone calling for a corpsman. And, you know, after the war, when we see Ira, unfortunately, drink himself to death effectively. And the other two from the outside, you know, they get married, they have children, they have consistent jobs. And you might be tempted to think that, you know, they went on and just lived happily ever after, that, you know, that they had successful lives, that they left this behind them. And then what we know, of course, is that that was not the case at all. And the war followed them for the rest of their lives and obviously had a massive impact on their families.
Yeah, I'm glad I saw it, this movie. We do need to rate it, though. Are we ready to rate it?
Yeah, we can rate it. How many misidentified backsides out of 10 would you rate this movie?
I would rate this movie a 6.3 misidentified backsides out of 10. It's alright. I enjoyed it. I didn't feel like it wasted my time. I would probably watch it again, maybe someday, but not soon. I thought the topics were more interesting than the execution of those topics, so that's what got me going. Not too much to say about this one, to be honest. How about you?
Yeah, I agree with you. It was cool to see a movie about war propaganda that did acknowledge sort of the string pulling behind the scenes and everything that was going on and the cynicism of trotting these guys out to sell war bonds and calling them war heroes and all that kind of stuff. I am going to give this 6 misidentified backsides out of 10. I thought Adam Beach was great. I didn't think any of the other acting was particularly great. Yeah, it was like an interesting premise for a movie. Definitely, you know, one that should have been made, probably could have been executed better, as you were saying.
All right.
Are you reading anything?
I am not really. I'm reading lots of things at the same time, but have not been reading for a couple of weeks. So everything is on hold. How about you?
Well, I just came back from vacation in Croatia and I picked up this book called A Dubrovnik War Story, They Won't Hurt Me, Mom, by Anita Radkijia. And it's a memoir about this woman who lived in Dubrovnik during the 1991 attack by the Serbians. I gather it's going to be a bit of a tough read.
I bet. So you haven't started it yet then?
No, I haven't. I just got back, so that'll be next up on the docket for me.
I think that's all then for this episode.
You can follow us at Rosie the Reviewer podcast on Instagram. You can follow us and rate us 5 stars wherever you get your podcasts. We would really appreciate that. You can visit our website, rosieTheReviewer.com. We throw up book reviews and all kinds of stuff on there. Is there anything I'm forgetting?
I don't think so. We're on in the Internet Movie Database, if you are into that.
Yeah. Next week, we have a sort of special episode. Do we want to say what's happening?
Do we want to spoil it, or do we want to keep it a secret?
Well, I think maybe we should spoil it just a little bit, because then it'll get people to actually tune in.
A little bit. Right. Next week, we have a Pacific special with an actor. Do we want to say who the actor is?
No, we'll leave it a surprise.
We'll have an actor on, guys. We'll have our first non-nerd, non-regular nerd on the podcast.
I was going to say, he might be a little bit of a nerd, but...
Yeah, a bit, yeah, I'm sure. All right. I'm really looking forward to it, but we're recording that tomorrow, guys. We're not nervous. We're really excited. All right. See you next week.
Bye.